All right. Good morning and welcome to part two of AI New York State's live webinar series, Reimagining Digital Transformations for the Architectural Profession. This was spearheaded by the Discussion Technology Group at AI New York State. And in this presentation, we will take a deeper dive as to how convergences of tools and digital technology are leading cutting-edge design solutions for the AEC industry and talk to industry experts that are not only users, but are also creators, integrators, and researchers to give us their opinion about the future of the architectural profession in the digital age. My name is Willy Zambrano, and I am pleased to be your moderator for today's program. This session will run approximately 1.5 hours with time for questions and answers at the end. In order to receive 1.5 LUs, you must be present for the entirety of the session. Throughout the program, you will see 4 words appear in the chat box on the screen and spoken by the speakers at various times. Take note of these words as you see or hear them. You will be required to write them on your CE card link that will be provided in the chat box at the conclusion of the program. This card must be filled and returned to us no later than tonight at midnight. Again, please be sure to open your chat box to see these words and CE card link. Questions and participation throughout the sessions are encouraged. If you have content questions for the presenters, use the chat box at the bottom of your screen and keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking. If you're having any technical issues or have a question about the webinar itself, use the chat box and we'll do our best to answer you during the webinar. Please note the following disclaimers. This presentation is protected by US and international copyright laws. Reproduction, distribution, display, and use of the presentation without written permission of the speakers is prohibited. This program is registered with the AIA CES for continuing professional education. As such, it does not include content that may be deemed or construed to constitute approval of any method, product, service, enterprise sponsorship, or endorsement by AIA New York State. The statements expressed by speakers, panelists, and other participants reflect their own views and not necessarily reflect the views or positions of AIA, AIA New York State, local components, or those of their respective officers, directors, members, employees, or any other organization associated with them and involved in the planning and production of this program. Questions related to specific products and services may only be addressed at the conclusion of this presentation. This webinar is associated materials are being provided for general educational purposes only. Information provided during this webinar and in the material should not be construed as professional advice. Participants should consult with a licensed architect or other appropriate professional concerning the subject matter of this webinar, the materials, and the applications to any specific facts or circumstances. The statements of the webinar, moderator and panelists are their own and are not the statements of the AIA New York State chapter. Our learning objectives are to explain the capabilities and benefits of each software, discuss the importance of leading-edge technological developments, explain best practices for implementing new software tools, discuss how digital technology is related to the built environment. As I mentioned, I will be serving as your moderator. I'm the design principal and founder at Zambrano Architectural Design LLC in Freeport, Long Island. I'm also on this AIA Strategic Council representing the New York region, as well as the president of the Queens Foundation for Architecture, the scholarship arm of AIA Queens chapter. My firm is a boutique design firm providing creative solutions to healthcare, educational, commercial, multifamily, and religious and private institutional design challenges in the tri-state area. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Alejandra Rojas and Matt Sokol of DesignMorphine, Nick Caravella of Ingenious IO, Jay Wall of Flur.ee, PVC, Violet Whitney of Columbia University and Sidewalk Labs, and Daniel Davis of HASSELL. Our first presenter will be Alejandra Rojas and Matt Sokol from DesignMorphine.
Okay, we're sharing our screen now.
And DesignMorphine is a global creative hub for design with the goal of providing custom workflows through workshops, lectures, projects, and explorations in the field of architecture, design, and the arts. Take it away, Alejandra and Matt.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So as Willy mentioned, we're kind of a big hub that Matt will explain shortly. My name is Alejandra, and we will take you through this presentation. Matt?
Yeah, sorry, do you have the screen set up?
Yeah, you can see it?
No, I still see the old screen.
Give me one
We
second.
see it.
You can see it?
Yes.
You can see. Well, I mean, I can start talking. I'm still
Okay.
seeing your screen, but yeah, so I'm Matt. I'm excited to be back. And DesignMorphine started with the goal of sharing knowledge about the latest architectural technologies. We have grown to over 30 members around the world. And most of our members are architects. However, we also include visual artists, fashion designers, programmers, and fabricators, which allow us to put on workshops that intersect in all areas of design and technology. We have put together over 60 workshops that take students from an initial concept all the way through to the final product. Our members develop a pipeline that balances technological sophistication and the ease of user interface in order to best streamline the process, allow participants with no previous experience to walk away with a finished 3D print or virtual reality model or any other finished product. We take into consideration what would be the best software for the specific task and how to set up and export files to go between different software, along with the different modeling techniques best suited for the end result. Next slide. When some of the tools aren't available, our members have created their own scripts and plugins, such as the surface modification tools like Pufferfish for Rhino and Grasshopper on the left, Dynashape for Revit on the right. And I would also like to invite you to check out OWL, which is a machine learning plugin for Grasshopper. Next slide. We have done several workshops on virtual reality and are extremely excited about the prospects it will introduce into the design world. As an architect, it's really a radically different experience to become immersed in your design, to get an understanding for the space, to understand the proportions, the lighting, and put yourself in the shoes of your future tenant. For example, in this workshop here, we want to create some very highly detailed sci-fi worlds. So we started with modeling meshes in Maya, then exported to Substance Painter for texturing, and then to Unity Game Engine for the VR immersion. Alternatively, for detailed building models, we can model in Rhino, export them with Datasmith for Unreal Engine, and be able to perform realistic renderings in Unreal Engine. Different lighting and weather effects can then be tested within Unreal. Unreal Engine is good because it features Blueprints, which is a visual scripting program that's similar to Grasshopper, which, although it has a different purpose, allows users to start interacting with the software without having to have an extensive coding background. These models can then just be exported and distributed as a standalone program, allowing a person with no architectural experience to walk through the projects like a video game. There are some plugins like Unity at Rhino, which offer less in terms of user control, but also allow architects much faster access to prototype their spatial experiences in virtual reality. While virtual reality provides complete immersion, separating the user off from the real world, augmented reality will bridge between the real and the virtual, layering the virtual world on top of the real, allowing the user to experience both at once. By combining augmented reality with digital twin 3D models, architects can be on the job site and view X-ray breakdown of all the mechanical, electrical, structural systems that are hidden within the walls. Punch lists will no longer be a list of bullet points, but a 3D model with each outstanding item flagged in space. Point cloud models created by 3D laser scans can be overlaid to provide a history of the job site and allow the architect to carry out site visits remotely. Supported by the blockchain, BIM models will ensure everyone's headset is always looking at the latest design scheme and the changes are posted in real time. Although we still need to wait for some of these technologies to develop, the idea of the architect leaving the drafting table to design in real time on the job site is not far off. Next slide.
So how can parametric tools benefit us? So it provides the ability to manipulate the shape of a model geometry with the given attributes. So for example, it allows us to create very complex geometries and quickly visualizing them by changing or manipulating some of the initial attributes or parameters. So we can start identifying what are the different design opportunities within our model and quickly start testing what is it that we want it to look like or to be. It also allows us to very quickly generate a lot of graphic imagery for our presentation with our clients. And more so, once we have our model, like Matt was describing, we can then, take our client inside our model or even take it as far as the construction process. So very quickly, I'm going to take you to a case study of the Morpheus Hotel by Zaha Hadid and Front, where the architect, the structural engineer, and the facade designer were collaborating within one 3D model where they were not modeling each single piece, but they had a 3D model with live attributes and live sets so that they could have a lot of feedback between what was the design intention, what was the structural analysis, and what could be fabricated. So it was a constant loop of feedback that they were doing. And a lot of the time that was investing setting up the initial model was then recuperated when they were generating the construction documents. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but in the end, it pays off by being able to produce these drawings rather quickly and then going into construction. And again, now you have kind of a 3D model to help you navigate the construction as well. And then we can also talk about machine learning tools. And now there is a lot of software such as Cove tools that allows us to analyze our building performance. So in this case, you have a software that is telling you what are the carbon emissions, where you are within the 2030 challenge, and things like that that can help you make better informed decisions as to how you want your building to be. And understanding that these softwares can help us at the very beginning of the design process or our project, it reduces a lot of the cost of design changes, because now we're integrating what kind of glass we want, not according to a specific project, according to a specific location and where is it that we want to be within our building performance. So for instance, this is a case study by Duda Payne Architects, where they actually analyze around or a bit over 3,000 buildings to then determine which one was the best solution, the one that got closer to the performance that they wanted to get. This is a little bit on the other side in terms of understanding also what machine learning can be. This is a project done by Jaron Van Lith, and it's kind of data matching, in terms of understanding what is the area, what is the perimeter length and width, and then identifying what is, in this case, the best layout that could fit within that perimeter. So the other good thing that you can do with this softwares is that you can create your own workflow. So in this case, we were creating a workflow for finding techniques to get our geometry and then get it structurally analyzed using Caramba 3D and then optimized using Galapagos. So all of these are accessible plugins for Rhino and Grasshopper. And then here we can quickly see how once again we have the geometry, we can start modifying those initial parameters that we set up. But then most exciting is when you can actually feed all those parameters into the optimization tool and say, okay, which is the best geometry that can give me a really good and efficient and cost-saving, perhaps, structural structure. So then again, we can even change this workflow and start introducing solar radiation by using another of the plugins, that is Ladybug. And then the good thing too is that we can work on like multiple project scales, and then we can also start inputting a lot of data within different scales. So for instance, in this project by, again, Sahadi, the 3D printed chair in 2014, you can start inputting like a human weight. And again, once you have this 3D model, the great thing is that you have all this data and all this information that you can like easily extract from it, not only in terms of like the 3D model, but also in terms of like what is the material density, what is the length of the printing time for each one of them, so that you can make your decision. And then we're also talking about wearable architecture where you can do jewelry design and whatnot. And so we're, you know, Facebook and Instagram. We have a bunch of like webinar series that are available at the moment. And we also do a lot of custom classes for offices, schools, and events. And we have a machine learning webinar coming at the end of July. And the word for you guys to keep in mind for the credits is parametric. Willy, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Alejandra and Matt. That was very nice. We will now hear from Nick Caravella. He's from Ingenious.io. Ingenious.io is an innovative solution platform designed to manage daily operations within business development, project execution, and through completion. Take it away.
Thank you, Willy. And I'm sure all of us are coming off of that last presentation and wondering how we can make more time to do some of this design exploration. So I'm here to talk a little bit about data and collaboration within the AECO industry. But like you, I'm also an architect, recently gone to the tech world. I'm a Jersey native, so hello to anybody of the Jersey family that's on the call today. But I right now live out in Denver, Colorado. And like many Jersey architects, I come from a large family of both contractors and design teams. And so if you're familiar with how we communicate with each other in practice, I'm sure you can guess how any of my holidays might have been like. So joking aside, I learned a lot growing up in this environment, just being a young kid and either framing some walls or walking through a punch list. But one thing that I always took to note from either the builders in my family or the designers in my family is that we were always really proud of our tools and the work and quality that we bring. And so that instilled in me early on that if I want to be good at what I'm doing, I need to be thoughtful about the tools that I use to communicate and collaborate with others. This fascination kind of bled into my career as a designer. I always looked at the tech we were using, whether it be AutoCAD and exploring how fields work before BIM was around, or then getting into Revit templates and thinking about how we can leverage data within our models to make better decisions. So by the time I actually moved to Denver about 3 years ago, I began thinking about this new idea of what was the architecture of architecture and how teams come together, how they communicate and exchange information so that we can create clarity and a path forward to not only better design, but better construction delivery as well. So as I started to develop my career into this new role, I realized as I gained responsibility at the firm, getting involved in business development and project management, that I was spending more and more time on administrative work rather than I was on design anymore. This was either creating work plans, developing proposals, or just going around managing the project teams. And so to me, it was clear that if we want to make more time for design, we really need to address the way that we get data into the right hands across not only our own internal teams, but the external teams as well. So I was at the AIA conference back in Las Vegas, where I was looking for a solution to help me do just that. And I met the CEO of Ingenious, and he was telling me how, what his experience was like in running a concrete company and an architecture firm out in Chicago. And he found that most of his team was always burdened by this idea that we needed to get information from one party to another. And it was taking away time from the stuff we love, the design. So leveraging his background in digital tech and info security, he began to develop tools for his own companies, but then realized very quickly that, well, wouldn't it be great if the GC was on here and the owner was on here as well, so that we could share the information together. I like to always illustrate this one point, especially as we get to a more data-centered world, is that all data is important. It's just not important to everybody. So how do we take this information and make sure we're disseminating it out to the right people every single time? So around that time when he started to do this, he realized that we need a real big idea to cross this chasm of this complexity of how teams communicate. And so rethinking all the tools that we have today into what could be the future of digital communication in the future and how we manage our projects. So to understand the problem in a little bit more detail, there are really two big things that kind of impact this. We have our technology stack, which are all the variety of tools that we use to manage information. And this could be Excel and Revit, going into things like Newforma, our own personal email, and recognizing that we have to constantly move information from one piece of technology solution to another technology solution. And that disjointedness between these things is what we call fragmentation. And that's just a little bit of an administrative time every time we move that information from one place to another. The second problem that our industry faces is the people, which is actually the opportunity at the same time, is the people stack. In order to get the right design for a project, we need to leverage a lot of different expertise. So our consultants need to come in who have worked on projects similar to that type before. We want a GC that's familiar with that. And so our teams are never the same. And so the languages we talk are never the same. And I always like to think about this almost as the story of the Tower of Babel, where people tried to go and build a tower as tall to reach the heavens. And God, in realizing that, blessed us with the ability to speak multiple languages that ultimately led the project into cost overruns and schedule delays that ended killing up the job. And that's why we don't have the Tower of Babel today. I think it's a very similar problem to what we discuss in the industry about making sure that we have the right information with the right people. This problem's so big, in fact, that Construction Dive back in 2018 wrote an article about $177 billion being spent in the United States year after year on construction rework. And digging into what caused all of that, 48% of it is associated with bad data management and communication issues between teams. So that's about $85 billion every year that's spent because we're playing the game of telephone and losing information as that information moves from team to team. So how do we fix it? A lot of you I know are familiar with different construction models from design build, IPD, and traditional delivery. And there's always a bit of complexity on how these teams collaborate. So we're familiar with the three-legged stool that we might have between the owner's team, the design team, and the GC team. But again, how do we get the right data in hands of the right people? And then how do we limit how much telephone that we're playing versus passing information along? And so a good example, an RFI is created by a subcontractor. They take this information, they pass it up to the GC. The GC takes it, they read through it, they file it on their own system, make their changes and adjustments, and then pass it up to the architect, who then in turn files it again, does this. And we do this file passing game, 5 or 6 times with every request for information or submittal or different things. And by doing that, we lose a little bit of information through that translation from one system to another and one team to another. And so what if, rather than creating our own workspaces and environments that we have to manage our platforms, we actually worked on something that was more collaborative, that helped remove the data handoffs and allowed us to focus on the work a little bit more. Ultimately, this would create an opportunity for data to be put in once. You know, the subcontractor is going to ask a question. Well, the GC doesn't have to file that question anymore. They can pass it along. And so taking those handoffs away and streamlining that process can help keep our data more secure and actually keep the conversation more streamlined. This then gets compounded a little bit more when we start to talk about the tech that we're using. So going back from that people stack now to the tech stack, we all have these tools that we use to manage either our investment communications if we were investing in the project, our owners using our own tools to make sure that that investment's staying on track. We as the architecture team are trying to make sense of the investment that's being made, the money that the GC is spending, and making sure that everything conforms to the documents all at the same time. And what this involves is picking stuff up from, say, Procore, moving it into new forma, then passing it over to the owner through email. And all of this fragmentation creates these gaps. This is where that opportunity for that miscommunication to happen. It also creates an opportunity for accountability to fall through. And so, you know, we've all worked with that owner before with their short-term memory that made a design decision and then forgot that they did it later on. And we have to go back and dig up that email. If we keep all of our correspondence in one place that's shared among people, we can easily track things like timelines and conversations so that we don't feel the impacts of this short-term memory that we're all victim of. There's a lot of things going on. This project's not our only project. And I remember working on 3 projects of the same typology and having to say, you know what, I can't answer this right now. I got 2 projects of the same type. I need to make sure I go look at it and just refamiliarize myself. And so that kind of familiarization and keeping a center of truth on projects is incredibly important. The other really important part of of cleaning up these gaps within our communication is internally, it makes a lot of sense as well. One example I always like to use is my experience working in the restaurant industry where our design timelines are very short. There was a lot of projects I did for small business owners that were 6- and 8-week design schedules. And in the example that I like to use, people put in their time on a bi-weekly basis most of the time at most of the firms that I've worked at. And then on that 3rd week, the accountant then has to go track down everybody who didn't put their time in, find that time, plug it into our work plans. And by the time that I got an update as a project manager on these jobs, we were already halfway through the delivery cycle. This means that I'm not getting the data I need as early as I need it to make the right decisions for projects, which allows, so by that time that I'm halfway through the project, if I'm overburning my budget, there's no way for me to catch up. And so how can we take away these communication gaps so that people are getting the right information they need so that we can make these decisions faster with the data that we are putting into these systems? And so what we envision the future to look like is having a platform for practice and collaboration. Everybody can share their information within one secure space. They control their information by controlling who they share it to. But once that happens, it becomes usable. And so the owner's managing a budget, the GC's managing a budget. What if we were to connect those things? So as information started to change, we could start to catch things before that OAC meeting 2 weeks from now. Also, again, going back to those internal, how do we take that one data input from my production staff who plugs in their hours, but then update my budget planning and my progress planning jobs to make sure that we're all getting the right information as quickly as possible and it's as accurate as possible. And so through this, we've thought, well, this platform for practice is a great way to think about the future of design in the profession, because ultimately, simplicity is what gets us where we're going. If we can do less, if we can do more with less through managing all of our data in one place, we can have clarity, purpose, and intention in all that we do so that we have time to explore these new ideas around design and design technology as well.
Thank you, Nick. Next, we have Jay Wolf from Flur.ee. Jay is the Director of Partner Enablement at Flur.ee. And Flur.ee is a blockchain-backed data platform built to power secure data sharing and trusted data ecosystems that can also apply to different market verticals, including the AEC industry. Jay?
Oh, Jay, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Willy, and thanks to AIA for allowing me to be part of this panel. As Willy said, I'm part of Flur.ee. We are a blockchain-backed data management platform. And we're actually a semantic knowledge graph database where the database schema, transactional inputs are all issued as transactions onto a blockchain ledger. My experience, I've actually have over 20 years of experience in aerospace, which is very different than architecture in some ways, but also very similar. I've been in engineering and data management. I've actually been with manufactured facilities and supported projects and supply chain management. So one thing that pops up from that industry, and I've found many industries in working with Flur.ee, is that there's often siloed data, different uses of different ERPs and CRM systems, Excel spreadsheets, and paper in some cases, believe it or not. So this seems to be a common thread. I look forward to learning more about the AEC challenges and going through what we offer today. Hopefully there'll be opportunity for leveraging that in your industry. I'm going to pull up the next slide, and after it comes up, I'm going to ask that you please don't close your eyes and shake your heads because there's a big word there. Blockchain. So I guess 2 points here. One, I want to first say is I'm not trying to talk you into using cryptocurrency, so please put that aside. And two is that I'm going to talk in basic terms through this definition to highlight key aspects of it. And then finally, at the end, I'll bring that back to what our Flur.ee offering is, which combines blockchain in a little bit of a different way. To start out, blockchain is a distributed digital ledger that uses peer-to-peer consensus within a decentralized network to validate transactions and a hashing algorithm to cryptographically link them to a chronological chain of records. So that is the definition. We're going to step through this, and I'm going to talk about each of the key aspects of this quickly. So distributed, so copied and shared across a network of computers or servers. Those are known as nodes. This can be public, private, or federated basis, depending on the level of trust between the participants in the network. It is notable that each node has a full copy of the ledger. The ledger itself is an electronic record of all historical transactions chronologically ordered. This can be compared to a traditional checkbook, for instance, where debits and credits are reconciled for each transactional change in the state of the account. Each member of the network, as I said, has a full copy of the ledger, which starts at block 0. Number 3, peer-to-peer. So the resources are shared directly between the nodes. So there's no third-party servers that require special communication protocols, etc. We'll talk a bit more about this. Number 4, consensus. So every transaction is approved or rejected by the network via consensus mechanisms. So consensus, with each new block addition, the network must agree upon the validity of the transaction within the block for this new block addition. It can be accomplished in a few different ways, and they can be different based on public or private networks. With the most known example, Bitcoin and Ethereum right now, it's solving a complex puzzle, partial Byzantine fault tolerance, proof of work. Soon Ethereum is moving to a proof of stake. And then there are other ones that can be used in a more trusted network, such as Raft, which is basically just agreement of more than 50% of the network participants. Once the consensus is achieved, the new block is added and broadcast to all other network members. So again, there's a full list, full ledger of all the information in there. It is decentralized. It's hosted by many independent nodes simultaneously, controlled by no single entity, and data is accessible to anyone within the network. So there's no man in the middle burden here where there's direct communication between them. No single entity controls or administers the database. In the public blockchain implementation, the participants are unknown and completely decentralized. Example again, blockchain. In private, consensus or federated, so this will be a collective like a supply chain where there are trusted participants in different aspects of the supply chain. They have permissioned access, and this can be controlled within the blockchain structure. It's attracted to many that interact with sensitive data because there's no central authority, and DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, are futile. So it is a network, public networks. Anyone can participate. Private networks, access by invitation. Public, as I mentioned, Bitcoin and Ethereum. Private, you may have heard of Hyperledger. Flur.ee is a private enterprise blockchain offering. We have more to it, which I'll get to, and there's others in this space as well. Transactions. So depending on the blockchain implementation, transactions can be any record update, including transfer of assets, creation of new records, as well as setting rules about how the interactions between the network members will occur. All blockchains are append-only ledgers, therefore no information about previous state is lost. In addition to that, each transaction is signed with public-private key cryptography. So there's a record of every change in state of the database, including who did what and by what authority in the case of private and federated ledger implementations for the blockchain. Hashing algorithms. So hashing algorithm converts transactional data into a unique digital fingerprint that cannot be reverse engineered. This is very helpful such that the integrity of the data can be assured throughout. Cryptographically linked. So the hash that I just mentioned is derived from the transactional data within the current block, as well as the previous block, in order to maintain the sequential order of information. So this, again, maintains the integrity of the blockchain. If a new block is added that doesn't maintain this requirement, it will be rejected by the network. Therefore, bad actors can be immediately identified. And then finally, a bit redundant here, but you do have a chronological chain of records. So a complete, immutable, time-ordered history of transactions approved by and accessible to the network. So with that, Flur.ee, our product, is a data management platform. And we include all of the things that I just talked about in an immutable ledger, a blockchain ledger, where we have, with specificity, embraced the standards by the World Wide Web Consortium, the RDF, Resource Description Format specifically, whereby data interaction using this technology allows us to communicate interoperability within our systems as well as with other systems. We have full implementation of blockchain cryptography, and it can be optionally decentralized. What we've done, though, is made this the backbone, if you will, to a graph database, a knowledge graph. And it's linearly scalable, so we can have read nodes throughout that have no burden on the network itself. We institute something called time travel query, whereby, as I was speaking before with a blockchain ledger, you can back up time to any previous state and know what the facts about the data were at that point in time. And we support our own Flur.ee QL, but also Sparkle, which is a RDF standard, and GraphQL, which are very common APIs. We also implement smart functions. This is similar to smart contracts on other platforms. With smart functions, you're able to actually truly use data-centric logic, whereby you can control the permissions for reading and writing the data, and the data is code itself. So truly have full capabilities with Flur.ee. In speaking with Willy and some others about potential opportunities or things for consideration by AIA and the AAC community, things that popped out were transparent change management control between partners, again, working within the network. Full visibility of track and trace. I know that there's significant interest in carbon neutrality, energy efficient material systems, and life cycle analysis and management that could be fully visible in a Flur.ee implementation. Trusted and transparent supply chain collaborations, architectural engineering design review and history. Again, I come from aerospace, and design reviews are critical, and decisions made there need to be locked in stone for that point in time. They obviously could change later, but the reason for the decision being made is critical. We could also support AI and ML learning and model improvement based on trusted historical data. Again, there's a full history of all data that was true, and that historical data could be used for projecting forward and improving learning and models for those technologies. Number 6 is a big one: interoperable machine-to-machine and human-readable data based on standards. So with this, Flur.ee, as I said, follows the W3C, RDF, Sparkle, and also the FAIR data standards to facilitate native semantic interoperability with any other compliant data source. So an example here would be with a Sparkle query, you can natively hook to other data sources within your network, your supply chain, within your industry, using a common language that makes it fully interoperable. We've even done an example case of this where we've made sample databases and hooked natively to Wikidata, which is a wealth of information and uses the same formatting. So we could simply list the name of a building, for instance, and that building, if it's a named building, may have a presence in Wikidata, and it would pull up the full history of everything about that building within the Wikidata data set. And finally, number 7, you have guaranteed audit compliance. Basically, anyone could come and ask at any time what was true at any point in time. That could be 1 minute ago, 1 year ago, years ago, to the millisecond, and you can provide immediately an answer to that because our product is based on time-aware, append-only ledger, which is blockchain. That's all I had for now. I look forward to hearing more about AEC interest in better data management. I think the previous 2 presentations, one mentioned blockchain and the other mentioned the need for interoperability. We feel like we can support that. Again, the company is Flur.ee. We are a public benefit corporation. Here's some links to our websites and Twitter feeds. I've also included my information here. I would love to engage with anyone on this call by LinkedIn or email. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
And word number 2 is platform.
Thank you, Jay. For anybody, just want to remind everybody that this program is being recorded, so you will have another opportunity to actually look at the slides as well as get the information that Jay just mentioned, and everybody else's information for that matter. We have, next up, we have Violet Whitney from Sidewalk Labs. Violet Whitney teaches urban analytics and tangible computing courses at Columbia University. It's a senior product manager for generative design at Google Sidewalk Labs, and co-leads Architects, a network for spatial tech. Violet?
Thanks so much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, and let me just present. Okie doke. Thanks for having me. So today I wanted to talk a bit about a couple of courses I teach at Columbia University, and really more about emerging trends happening in spatial tech, and just show a few examples from my courses. So there's a few things that I think are really important today in spatial technology. What I mean by spatial technology is anything from, you know, grasshopper, parametric design, generative design, but also things that impact the design of physical space. So Internet of Things products, the things that change our interaction in physical spaces. And these two trends I'm going to talk about is measurement and the democratization of design of physical space. So by measurement, I mean things such as urban analysis, so environmental modeling, the real-time feedback about how a design is performing as we're modeling it, and the post-occupancy evaluation of how that design performs ultimately. So IoT applications that allow us to measure post-occupancy of how a space actually behaves. And what this means is that we can think about the whole life cycle of a building and align around incentives for what we're designing and focus on the outcomes. And what that also means is that we ultimately might change how we charge for design services. Rather than charging for the building itself, we might charge for the behavior of that building or the outcome, for the quality of life or the pedestrian footfall. So in my class at Columbia, students are encouraged not to think about physical aspects, not just the walls, the streets, the infrastructure. You know, Rhino captures 3 dimensions at a physical, all the physical aspects at a single moment in time. But we try and think about the behavior, think about time, about movement, about growth, about how policy impacts that design, and what that ultimately does to the types of interactions that happen, so that we can design for and understand, you know, how neighbors might share resources within certain walk distances, or how autonomous vehicle fleet size impacts congestion, how the UX on an app impacts wait times, or how a pandemic can spread based on policy, or how walk times are impacted by the makeup of a street, or what it might look like if we designed Google Maps routing for an individual's preference to walk past nature, past streets, or walk past areas with more activity. So in the future, we're going to need to think a lot more about design in terms of these ephemeral aspects, about the behavior and about the outcomes, and the ability to measure these both through simulation and ultimately post-occupancy studies actually allows us to align much more on the incentives of what that design does, rather than just the physical presence of that thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about was democratization. And so what I mean by democratization is accessible programming. So I don't need to know how to code to be able to do the things that programming does. So something like, if folks are familiar with If This and That, or one of these websites that allows you to string together Internet of Things applications. So I can do something like go to this website and say, okay, if the temperature increases in this room, send me an email. Or if the temperature increases in this room, turn on a fan in that room. Essentially, I'm writing code with these very simple actions, but I'm not typing in function statements and having to have a whole background in computer science. The other thing is codified knowledge. So a structural engineer can share a Grasshopper script to automatically lay out columns in a building without needing to do structural calculations. A non-expert or a designer can use those type of tools. So codifying that knowledge in a way that makes it more accessible to other people. And what that means is that in the future, more people can participate in the design, allowing people who are ultimately going to live in these spaces, in these cities, to have a say in what the designs will be like. And I think that's particularly important for the architecture community, which has historically been predominantly white and male. And while that's no stand-in for increasing representation in the architecture and urban design, field, it does point to a more positive shift where we're seeing designing with rather than designing for as a kind of new standard for what design processes should be. So in a class that I co-teach with Gabby Brainerd called Measuring the Great Indoors, we teach architects and designers to think about using these accessible programming platforms like If This and That to play with designing interactive indoor environments. So where architects usually have to create models or simulations to understand how a building will ultimately behave, because it takes decades before, or years before you would see how a building performs. Designing with microservices like If This and That, this super accessible programming, allows someone to create a design for an indoor environment and immediately see how that performs or impacts the behavior in that space. So where code used to be incredibly monolithic, you had to work at Autodesk to change the software, write a whole smart home application. You would have to work at Amazon. Microservices take what's usually a large monolithic application and pull out that little bit of executable code. So for example, If This and That, someone can write that simple, a very simple statement. If this happens, do this other thing, without having to have that whole monolith of code. So in our class, students design simple code recipes. If something happens, do this action. This was like the very early prototyping thing we did with just cards to get some ideas. And here are some examples. We had a lot of fun just naming these. If you're mentioned on Instagram, water my plant, that's the ego grower. If you measure no women in the meeting, send an alert email. This student made a device that would change based on activities that were happening in the room. That would change the light based on what was happening in the room. So the idea was that if I go to bed, the color of my environment will change. And it was always really funny trying to prototype with these things because they were very much hacky prototypes. Half the time you'll get the exact opposite behavior than you actually want. So the technology is definitely not quite there yet to be fully accessible. This student was really interested in buildings having a personality. And so this building is trying to tell you to open a window when the temperature outside looks nice. And this student was interested in changing the mood lighting of an environment based on the actual moods of people in the room. So it would respond not by who switches the light on, but how a group of people are actually feeling. So what's interesting about a lot of these experiments is how much they allow non-programming experts to control the environment. And you can imagine a future where any person can participate in the design of indoor environments, but it's not just designing our interiors. Democratization also allows people to participate in master planning or building design or design of other types. So again, the big things, democratization and measurement. So measurements will change incentives, allow us to ultimately charge for outcomes rather than building as an object. And democratization is going to allow us to design with people rather than for people. If you're interested in any of the stuff I shared today, here's a couple links to the courses I covered, or you can reach out directly through the Architecties group, which is a group of architects, non-architects, people interested in spatial tech by joining this Slack group. And I think our next word is ledger. So thank you very much. And
thank you, Violet. That was very interesting. Our final speaker is Daniel Davis. He's from HASSELL. Daniel Davis is a senior researcher at HASSELL, a multidisciplinary architecture, design, and urban planning practice. Daniel?
Cool, thanks, Willy. Yeah, thank you all for being here. The title of my talk today is Automatic Architecture Anxiety, and I think it's kind of maybe appropriate after all those other talks about how things are changing and how all the kind of things that are coming at us as a profession. Yeah, so this talk, it's actually one that I gave in Australia just before COVID-19 broke out. And the title itself, it comes from a friend of mine, Robbie Fordyce. And yeah, he's not an architect or a designer, but I think it sort of perfectly captures this moment. And I guess I'll kind of explore that today in this talk, going through some of these kind of anxieties that we have. I guess I want to start by saying that a lot of these things that we're talking about, particularly around like automation and data, aren't necessarily new to our field. Pretty much since the invention of the computer, architects have been trying to find ways to change and automate the profession as a result of it. And a lot of this early work didn't work for a whole variety of reasons, but I think as you kind of have seen in some of the presentations so far, in the last couple of years, there's been some really big breakthroughs in the way that architecture is practiced and the way that buildings are produced. And some of this, I think, ties in really nicely to what Violet was talking about. But as I'd say, from my point of view, there's three real major changes. One's the kind of rise of data or the accessibility of data. The second's like systematization of the construction process. And the third is this kind of new relationship that we have to technology these days. So I'll go through these really quickly and then kind of talk about the anxieties that they induce. So the first is data, and Violet talked a little bit about this in relation to kind of measurement. And I just kind of want to reiterate that for most architects, I think the idea of what actually happens behind closed doors in the projects they produce, it's something of a mystery. And when we're talking about performance and design outcomes, not knowing what happens in a building is a real kind of impediment to the industry and creating environments that work for people. And you're seeing in a whole bunch of different industries, the kind of just absolute explosion in the amount of data that's being produced. And the building industry is no exception. A lot of this is kind of happening, I'd say, on the fringes of mainstream practice. So you have companies like Disney, for instance, using, in this case, a magic band that tracks where people are in their parks and gives them feedback on how people experience those spaces. Amazon and their physical stores using cameras to track where people are and getting data back on how people are exploring and seeing products in the physical world. You have companies like WeWork using data to make predictions about which spaces are more likely to be sold. And at HASSELL, we're starting to kind of tap into this a little bit. In the research group, our major kind of focus at the moment is trying to find ways to get regular feedback from our projects and to collect data more regularly on them. I think the second major change that you're seeing in the industry at the moment is systematization. And one of the most kind of poignant examples of this, and these numbers are a little bit out of date now, but I think they're still pretty representative of what's happening in the industry. When you look at the architectural services industry in the United States, it brings in about $45 billion. So that's architecture firms, landscapes, interiors, that's like the fees that they're bringing in. You look at the amount of money that's being invested just in like startups in this kind of space, it's around about $10 billion a year. So a huge amount of money in comparison to the kind of services that architects are pulling in. And of course, these property tech firms aren't going after architects, they're actually going after this much larger opportunity, which is the $10 trillion construction industry. So we're seeing a lot of people kind of investing a lot of money at the moment at finding new ways to construct architecture, whether or not that involves an architect. Katera is like a really prominent example. I'm sure you've all kind of heard of it. Trying to vertically integrate basically the construction process. Building a whole bunch of factories and stuff like that, their own software. At HASSELL, we're thinking about this a little bit as well, where this is a project that we did for the Mars Habitat competition. There's a really good TED talk by the person that led this, Xavier, that if you want to watch it. But for us, the kind of Mars competition, it wasn't really that we wanted to be building architecture on Mars. It was more an opportunity to kind of think about what it's like to construct an environment where resources are really constrained. So it costs thousands of dollars to send a pound of material onto Mars. So in that kind of environment, what is it like? What is the kind of systems that are there for constructing and building architecture? And these are kind of lessons that we can then take from thinking this kind of really extreme kind of abstract situation and bring it back to more real kind of projects that we deal with day to day. The third major change I think that you're seeing in the industry at the moment is this like new relationship to technology. And this quote from Negroponte, I think, sums it up beautifully. And it's a really, really old quote where he's kind of talking about how technology and computers back in the 1970s, the way that the design process itself was broken, and trying to replicate the broken design process and automate it on a computer is just going to create more bad architecture, because the process itself is the thing that needs to change. And I think a lot of the kind of early experimentations with computation and digitization of architecture relied on kind of taking a kind of skeuomorphic approach of taking the drawing board and turning it into something that was digital. And there's a whole bunch of different companies at the moment that are experimenting with new ways of doing this. Testbit's one that I think is really cool. They're generating these kind of parametric buildings that if you're a developer, you can change a whole bunch of site parameters and they kind of work out what's most efficient for a site. The Living's another kind of example of an architecture firm that's been able to create these new tools that, rather than drawing the building, are kind of generating various aspects of them. And I think all of this kind of brings up a whole bunch of anxiety for the industry. And I think in many ways, a lot of this is really human and really understandable. Like if your professional identity is tied up in producing architecture, and these systems are coming along and maybe not replacing your job, but replicating some aspects of it, I think it brings up this kind of really human question of like, what is my worth in that system? And what is my identity in that kind of world? If we're talking about these kind of systems that are pushing towards creating better places, I think there's a real kind of tension that exists. And what if we don't agree on what the definition of better is? And I think a lot of the kind of pushback you see against big kind of tech companies entering into this space is that their definition of what a good built environment is probably isn't the same definition as what us as architects and what the community as a whole kind of agrees upon as being a better outcome. I think particularly relevant to the current kind of situation that we're living in and the things that we're kind of grappling with at the moment, that a lot of these systems that we're talking about are tools that are kind of optimizing for the masses or designing for the mean. And that for people that aren't necessarily in that kind of cohort of the masses or on the edge of what we would consider normal, it creates a lot of problems where perhaps they're left out of a lot of these kind of systems, because these systems aren't considering or designing for them. They're designing for what is kind of normal. And finally, I think something that we dealt with a lot when I was working at WeWork was this idea that we're really kind of optimizing and designing for how things are in 2020. How do these systems kind of accommodate the kind of messiness and uncertainty that might come about in 2030? And how does these kind of very precise systems kind of deal with these forms of kind of uncertainty and unknowingness? So I'll leave it there, but the final word for you is generative.
Thank you, Jay. This has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you all for your presentations. It's really an eye opener for me, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way. We'll open to the Q&A session. I'll be asking you a few questions to the panelists. But if you're not speaking, please keep your microphones muted at all times. And if you have any questions, please feel free to utilize the chat box again. We have about, I would say about 26 minutes, and we want to use them as much as we can. I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask all the panelists to answer, each in their respective order of presentations. And one of them is, given the state of flux of digital transformation and what our profession is actually going through, how can we as a profession leverage digital technologies to increase equity and be as relevant to a digital transformation that accelerates almost every day? We'll start with you, Alejandra, and Matt.
Sure. I think there are many like different like answers to this, but in terms of like I guess one of the things that DesignMorphine tries to do is put the education and the knowledge of like actually how to use all these softwares forward, because the knowledge as to like where to find, for instance, tutorials or webinars sometimes is very limited. So the idea of creating DesignMorphine as a hub where you have a lot of like not only architects but motion designers and animators is to like put a lot of like different workflows that people can use, not only just exclusively for design but also for other realms. So I think it's making, again, like the knowledge more accessible for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think constantly kind of collaborating with our other design fields, so you keep getting kind of knowledge from areas where previously architects didn't really consider a certain approach to the problem. I think also technology in itself has been constantly becoming much more user-friendly, where, I mean, previously AutoCAD, you had to kind of manually put in each point, and we keep developing more plugins. I think, you know, the kind of visual scripting languages like Grasshopper and Blueprints really allow people without very advanced coding knowledge to perform kind of coding functions. As Violet mentioned, the if this then that, programs like that are very helpful. And I think also just being able to make sure that this technology stays open, becomes open source, and isn't kind of proprietary only to like one company that holds a monopoly over how this technology has to be used, but really allowing it to be distributed to the people, allow everyone in the architecture field to create plugins and to be able to share them with each other and kind of share the knowledge.
Nick, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I took away when I was studying for my architecture exams was in systems, we looked at, you know, how to make the efficiency of a building better and look for the things that were least efficient at first and figure out those. So I know coming off of webinars like this, it could be like, okay, well, where do I start? And so being very thoughtful about how your firm does things and what your process is, I think, a really great way to look at that and think about where are we spending a lot of time doing certain things, and what are the tools we can use to address those problems. Because there's a lot of different ways to solve situations, but you might be doing something really well that other people aren't. So to look for that silver bullet and say, how should I be managing my firm, is a little bit complicated because everybody can improve in different ways. So I always like to say, it's like, this starts with introspection and thinking about what we need to communicate and how we communicate, and then designing almost a path for how we do our architecture as much as we design our path for the building.
Jay, you have anything to add to that? Even though your world of technology is outside of our realm, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely I do. I think in any organization and from all of the presentations that were held today, there's a lot of data. And I think every organization needs to be a data organization to remain competitive and relevant, first of all. And then kind of along the lines of what the others were discussing as far as interoperability and using standards, that will be key to the advancement of the exchange of data and the ability to manage supply chains. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for AEC. I've seen already some things that you guys have implemented, but I think there may be opportunity to better leverage a data-centric approach, you know, to truly facilitate interoperability is the main thing that I've picked up on.
Violet?
I think that we should think about architecture and urban design more expansively. And what I mean by that is in the same way I talked about measuring and behavior and outcomes. I think there's a big opportunity for people in the architecture and design industries to change their business model from thinking about delivering a physical building or aspect to thinking about delivering specific outcomes. And if we're interested in increasing the equity in the profession, it's not just about increasing representation in the field. It could also mean changing the way that we design buildings. And, you know, what I think has been really interesting lately is you've seen tons of work in spatial data visualization, where you can go to the New York Times and see these interactive 3D visualizations of a officer involved shooting that show the evidence behind something. Now that's something that architects do. We model and visualize physical space. In the same way, we can be modeling and visualizing power dynamics in physical space, or thinking about the logistics at Amazon and what kind of congestion that creates, or what kind of power dynamics that might create about which neighborhoods have access to something and which don't. So I think that they're just visualizing and designing these more ephemeral systems like power dynamics and whatnot. One that makes us more competitive because it's focused on the ultimate outcome. It's of this time because we're thinking about time and behavior. We're thinking about visualizing the way a city actually behaves or interacts, not the physical aspect. But it also means that we're making a much more equitable profession because we are visualizing those things that architects haven't always visualized. We haven't visualized the behavior or the power dynamics in a physical space. So I think we can think about what architects do more expansively than just delivering a drawing set or like delivering the design of a physical object.
Absolutely, absolutely. Daniel, you want to add to that?
I think, yeah, I'd agree with what Violet says there. I think in many ways the kind of impact or outcome of technology is really overstated in our industry. There's a lot of people that see technology as being this kind of silver bullet that's going to somehow save the practice. And I think the evidence just isn't there to support that. We've had decades now of technology kind of come out, and I see no evidence that it's really made any kind of significant impact in terms of equity or in terms of yeah, any of that aspect of it. And so to me, this feels like a much more kind of systemic structural challenge, and maybe technology plays a role, but I think there's far more that's needed than just a new kind of plugin.
Which brings me to another question that that we as a profession and also as an organization, we feel that sometimes we have to be leading that charge in some aspect. So I'm wondering, how can the AI produce change or disrupt this transformation in some way that we can actually lead instead of following? I'll go back to Violet, and maybe she can expand on this.
Sure. I don't know if this is controversial to say in the AIA, but I would say relax licensing, make other options for architects. I had to make a really difficult decision after putting in tons of time at architecture firms and going through getting my master's, and then recognizing, oh, hey, actually,
I'm sure most of us feel the same way. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think I realized that the type of impact I wanted to make wasn't happening in architecture. I was like, in an architecture firm, I was building luxury architecture and like putting a community room in it and hoping that that was good enough. And meanwhile, the world was changing around me, where the things changing physical space were these big tech companies like Uber and Seamless and Airbnb. Like, those change physical space too. So I was like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't be thinking about getting a license. I should be taking this knowledge I have and going into technology and working on spatial technology, where I can have a really large influence. So I think architects should own that power, like that we have a lot of useful knowledge and skills, but we're confining ourselves to this very narrow identity of what an architect does. So I think the AI should embrace that and find other ways to channel architects into these types of professions where, one, they can probably pay their student loan debt off, but also they can have really meaningful impact in the world. We need people that are thinking about urban design challenges and are trying to design with a knowledge of context and history of places. We need those people in companies like Amazon and Uber and Seamless. So.
Daniel, you have anything to say on that regards, or?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree in like expanding the kind of remit of the profession, but I also think like within the profession, like the real sort of advantage of it is that it's an opportunity to like pull resources and for firms to kind of come together collectively. And so I think of all these things that firms do in terms of technology that suck up a whole bunch of time and aren't like a competitive advantage. So whether that's working on like drawing standards, or whether that's like reinventing the same Grasshopper script or whatever it is like that. And I feel like there's a chance there for the AIA to kind of step in and offer some leadership and guidance. And I also look at like, look at a startup like Upcodes, which is one that is taking sort of the building code and digitizing it and allowing you to kind of compare your Revit model against it. And like, why isn't AI buying that company and giving it to free for all the members? Like, that would save everyone a whole bunch of time. And I mean, it seems like a much better use of their resources than whatever else they're doing. So I sort of feel like pulling collective resources like that, there might be some like innovative things that AIA could do to really help out firms and architects.
The kind of Amazons of the world kind of resonates with a lot of stuff that is being discussed here. And one of them is actually platforms, right? Amazon started with a platform and ended up being what it is right now, leading the charge of all retailers out there through the web. Who knew that could actually happen? So I'm wondering, and you touch a little bit up on it, and I want to change the discussion a bit towards Katera, And Katera seems to be leading the charge as a one-stop shop, almost identical to what Amazon did for the retailers out there. And I'm wondering if this is one disruptive company that can probably somehow become that disruptor in our industry. What is your thought about that, Danny?
So, yeah, like there's a whole bunch of these companies, right? Like Katera, there's Juno Apps, Generate, a whole bunch of different firms kind of in this space. But also look back at my time at WeWork, and I mean, we lost billions of dollars hand over fist there, and probably one of the best markets of all time. And the people that made money during that time were architecture firms. So I think, I mean, there is disruption coming there, and some of these firms are going to stick it and be successful in that space. But I also think we can't be too reactionary to what they're doing there. Lots of these things also aren't going to work out.
That is true. I'm just, you know, wondering if something like that could actually happen. Jay, what do you think in all these discussions?
Yeah, so I did look at Katera, and they seem to have a very interesting, all-encompassing model that they're pushing forward for AEC. Again, I'm not in the industry, but I think it's definitely something where AIA probably should be preparing for what they're offering and embracing aspects of it. Because the technology is there and or is coming to light now. It's hard for me to make specific positioning about it. Obviously, I'm not in the industry, but that was my takeaway.
Nick, what do you feel about the AI to produce change and maybe lead instead of following? What would you like to? What is your opinion on that?
It's an interesting question, because I think we as an industry need to be a lot more honest with ourselves when it comes to technology adoption. We are, as AEC, the laggard when it comes to adopting technology only to agriculture. And so this concept that we're bleeding edge in a lot of ways is largely a fallacy. We create documents of drawings with BIM that look very much like they do when we did them with CAD and with pen on paper. And so I think the first thing that the AIA and really all of us as members within the Institute can do is start to acknowledge that there is this resistance to adopting technology, that there are individuals who are doing great work right now. Some of them have just shared that work with you. But we're not challenging this bleeding edge enough. We're also historically as an institute very risk adverse, and a lot of our firms are very risk adverse. And so things that I personally see where BIM allows us to look at things like quantities and cost and provide some real models and analytics that can help the people that we serve make better business decisions, are where I personally believe we need to be diving in and maybe taking back some of that risk and contributing more to the projects themselves through that. So I think a little bit of it is kind of, we need to take some reflection for a minute and think about what does the practice of architecture look like with tools like this, and how do we start to get more of the pie back onto our plate. But then, is the AIA the right mode for this? Why, I guess that it's always the hard question is the AIA supposed to be what's driving this, or should it be creating opportunities for things like this where we are sharing ideas and creating a way for us to hold each other up and allowing, say, the free market, if you will, to enable people to succeed and then share to grow the industry that way. So I think it's a very complicated thing. I think the AIA can be a forum for what these ideas are and allowing people to evaluate them. But I think the biggest thing that we need to take away from any of these talks is that, when the studies are done, our industry is not adopting technology near as quickly as other ones are. And I'd love to return back to what Violet said about the barrier of licensure. I have learned far more about project management and product management in the year I've been in the tech world than I think I ever might have in the architecture firms. And a lot of that really comes from, I think, our oral tradition of learning. We work in firms, we learn from the people who have been practicing before, but aren't necessarily challenging why or how they're doing things. And so we need to enable people outside the realm of licensure to pressure our system and create new ideas and new opportunities to innovate and add value to what we do.
Thank you, Nick. Alejandra, before I kick it up to some of the questions that the audience have been putting out on the chat box, you wanna add anything to that?
I think I agree with everything that they have been saying, but in general, I think that creating platforms like this where we can like collaborate and present some of like the work also allows for this conversation to happen. But also, I think that within research, a lot of like knowledge can be gained, not to like you're saying follow, but to start actually knowing what's out there and what could be there. I think that right now in architecture, there's a big gap between academia and the actual industry as well. And a lot of like these conversations that we're having about behavior, about data, they are already happening in academia with like very strong ideas, not only in the built environment, but also in, you know, how can we have like automated small vehicles that can actually turn into sculptures when they are not being used, and having them being solar power, and what is the network that they work in. So it's kind of like how we start minding the big gap between what is next with architecture versus what we can actually achieve within the industry that, you know, people still need to make money and we still have clients that they want everything for yesterday, because the construction industry needs to move very fast. You know, everything is fast paced. That's why as an architect, you don't get that much time to like, oh, let's research on like the best glazing that we can use for this project, because we don't have time for it. So we end up speccing, you know, the one that we used for a previous work, or the recent rep that came by, you know, for like a wine and cheese and got us, you know, believing that this was the greatest product ever. So I think a lot of work needs to get into actually compiling all this new technology, you know, and so that people know also how to use it.
I agree. We'll take a few questions from the panel, from the audience before we are done with the program, but I encourage you to actually send us any comments afterwards. I'll take the questions for the entire panel from Seth Wiley. It says, what about DOE, BASC, and CERF programs in terms of how these programs have simplified, improved building information, as well as have facilitated marketplace acceptance? Possibly programs like this are examples of good future state to transform forward. If anyone wants to take a crack at that, responding to that question. No?
Guessing and thinking. It's interesting because it's with the realm of data and in how more information can be getting into things, we can be making better decisions for our models and our projects. And so, well, actually, in talking what the AIA could possibly do is working with vendors to develop the right relationships to get us the right data so that we could be making better decisions with our modeling. Looking at creating, say, a task force, for example, around building envelope efficiency, and talking with vendors about the right kind of parameters that we need to be getting into our models to be doing that work. Those kind of strategic partnerships, I think, are a really great opportunity for the AIA to develop so that we are getting the right data from the people who are delivering that data to us, so we can then respond to these programs and make the best decisions for our projects.
Thank you, Nate. Does anybody wants to add to that, or should I get another question out there? We got about 1 to 2 minutes left. Here's one question. These new tools and working formats are heavily dependent on constraint-based modeling data. We are in Anthropocene. We do not have an agreed upon global resource planning framework to set our regional constraints according to planetary boundaries. And 4, we do not have agreed upon global human rights framework. What constraint data sets is legitimately valuable in social ethical terms? Violet, I think this one you can probably respond to.
Oh no, I actually have to jump to a meeting at 1. I'm very sorry. That was not ill-timed. But thank you very much for having me today.
All right, thank you, Violet. And I'm sorry we ran out of time. This has been a wonderful experience with all the panelists. And please check out the chat box for that link to the CE cards. And don't forget to actually link up to the link before midnight tonight to get your credits. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.